Anything but the Canadians. Why SS commanders chose suicide over facing the water rats. February 1945. The Rhineland, Germany. SS Obersturmführer Walter Kremer sits in a bunker, his trembling hand scrawling a final letter to his wife. Beyond the wall lies the Rhine. On the other side are them, the ones his soldiers called Die Wasserratten, the water rats. Kremer has heard the stories that they swim across the icy river at night in total silence, knives clenched in their teeth. They take no prisoners. They slaughter entire garrisons before anyone can squeeze a trigger. In the morning, a patrol finds Kremer with a pistol in his hand and a hole in his temple. He preferred a bullet to a meeting with the Canadians. He was not the only one. But to understand how Canadian farmers and fishermen turned into killers, feared even by the SS, one must go back 6 months, to the banks of the Scheldt, where it all began. The autumn of 1944 was a moment of truth for the Allies in Europe. The Normandy landings were a success, Paris was liberated, and German forces were reeling eastward. It seemed the war was about to end, but the Allies had one catastrophic problem they preferred not to discuss aloud. They were starving, not figuratively, literally, and this is why it nearly cost them the victory. Supplying a million-man army required ports. The only port capable of handling enough cargo was Antwerp, captured back in September. But Antwerp sits 60 kilometers from the sea at the mouth of the Scheldt River. Both banks of that estuary were controlled by the Germans. No ship could enter. Antwerp was useless. But geography was only half the nightmare. The second half awaited those who dared to break through. The Scheldt estuary was hell for any attacker. A labyrinth of islands, peninsulas, dikes, and polders, land reclaimed from the sea. The Germans simply opened the sluice gates. By October, the northern bank had turned into a total swamp. Tanks sank into the mud up to their turrets. Artillery couldn't find solid ground. Boats were sitting ducks for German machine guns. British command saw no solution. The Americans refused to participate, calling the operation, quote, 3. Then Canadian General Harry Crerar uttered a phrase that would go down in history, quote, 4. But even he didn't realize what his boys would become in a few short weeks. By the fall of 44, the 1st Canadian Army was a strange formation. Its corps consisted of 3 infantry divisions that had survived Normandy and the Falaise Pocket. They had lost thousands of men, but those who survived were a different breed. Canadian veterans had been fighting for 5 years, since 1939. Unlike the Americans who were drafted, the Canadians were volunteers. Each had chosen this war for himself, and here is the vital thing to understand. By 1944, the _6_ were long dead. Others remained. Those who survived Dieppe, the catastrophic raid of 1942, remained. Those who had learned to hate the Germans with the kind of intensity that only comes from seeing what they do to prisoners remained. Those who had stopped believing in the Geneva Convention remained. But even these hardened veterans had no idea what awaited them on the Scheldt. The first lesson would be brutal. On October 2nd, 1944, the 3rd Canadian Division launched an offensive on the _7_ command. Expected the operation to take a few days, it would take a month, and it would become a meat grinder. The first attack literally drowned. Infantry moved through flooded fields, sinking waist deep in mud. German machine guns opened up. Men fell into the water and drowned under the weight of their gear. By the end of the first day, 200 casualties for 400 meters of progress. The second day was the same. The third, the same. Traditional tactics were failing. Then a few officers decided to change the rules of the game. What they devised would make the Germans regret ever hearing the word, quote, 8. Captain Jean-Paul Gauthier of the Royal Regiment of Canada was one of the first to realize the core truth. If you cannot advance by land, you must advance by water. Not through the water, but on the water. Use the flooded fields as cover. Gauthier gathered 20 volunteers, fishermen from Nova Scotia and hunters from Quebec, men raised on the water, men who knew how to sit motionless for hours in freezing conditions. Their first operation took place on the night of October 6th. 20 men in inflatable boats, faces smeared with mud, armed with knives and submachine guns. It was just a trial run. The real terror would begin when the Germans realized what was happening. They approached the German position from the rear, from a direction no one expected an attack. The __9_ swamp proved perfectly passable for men born on the water. They took out a machine gun nest in 40 seconds. Not a single shot, not a single scream. In the morning, a German officer found 5 corpses with their throats slit and a note on a piece of cardboard. Quote, 10. It was a joke, the dark humor of exhausted soldiers. No, the Germans didn't realize it was a joke. Soon, that name would become a curse. After the first success, the tactic spread like wildfire. October 6th, 1 raid, October 9th, 3. By October 15th, Canadian night groups were operating across the entire front. German command couldn't grasp what was happening. Their positions were impregnable, yet every morning brought new bodies, destroyed gun nests, and sabotaged depots. The German reports from that period read like a chronicle of mounting madness. But the scariest thing in those reports wasn't the losses, it was the rising dread between the lines. October 7th. Lost contact with the 3rd Platoon. Upon inspection, bodies of all 12 men. No signs of a firefight. October 11th. The enemy attacks from directions we considered impassable. Soldiers are demoralized. October 17th. Men refuse night sentry duty. They speak of water ghosts. Discipline is collapsing. And that was only the beginning. On October 20th, an incident occurred that forced the German command to rethink everything. The 3rd Battalion of the Hermann Göring Parachute Regiment, the Luftwaffe Elite, veterans of the Eastern Front, took positions on a key dike. These were no ordinary soldiers. They had seen Stalingrad, Kursk, and the retreat through Belarus. They were unbreakable. On the night of October 20th, the battalion went silent. In the morning, scouts found the position. All 67 men were dead, not a single shot fired, only knives and garrots. But the most macabre part was the staging. The bodies were piled in a row, neatly, as if someone had spent time creating a tableau. On the bunker wall, a charcoal inscription, Die Wasserratten grüßen die Fallschirmjäger. The water rats greet the paratroopers. The investigation determined the attack was carried out by a group of no more than 30 men. They had infiltrated through a flooded drainage canal deemed impassable. The entire operation took 20 minutes, 67 men in 20 minutes, without a single shot. The regiment commander sent a report to Army Group HQ. We are facing an enemy that observes no rules of war. I recommend evacuating the sector. The recommendation was denied. There was nowhere to evacuate to. But something changed forever. The Germans on the Scheldt realized they were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. And that realization would break them faster than bullets. By late October, the water rats had evolved from an improvisation into a system. Command began forming special groups within every battalion. The selection was simple. Men who could swim in freezing water didn't fear the dark and could kill with their bare hands. Surprisingly, there was no shortage of volunteers. Training took 3 days. Day 1, night swimming in full gear. Day 2, hand-to-hand combat. Day 3, a combat sortie. Yes, the 3rd day was a real operation. If you came back alive, you were trained. If you didn't, you weren't the right fit. Losses among the _20_ were staggering, roughly 40% in the first month. No, those who survived became legends, and that legend began killing Germans before the Canadians even reached their positions. The psychological effect was more powerful than anyone expected. German soldiers began showing signs of mass nervous exhaustion. An epidemic of _21_ broke out. Soldiers refused to go on sentry duty in the dark. Doctors knew it wasn't a physical ailment, it was fear. Men preferred to feign blindness than stand watch. Self-inflicted wounds spiked. Desertion increased. Several officers committed suicide with similar notes. I can't wait anymore, but one case eclipsed the rest, showing the true scale of the German terror. On November 8th, SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend received orders to take positions against the water rats. Meyer was a veteran with an Iron Cross, Poland, France, Russia. He knew no fear. When he learned who he would be facing, he requested a transfer. The request was denied. The next morning, Meyer was found with a bullet in his head. Beside him was a 3-word note, Nur nicht Kanadier, anything but the Canadians. It wasn't the only suicide. By the end of the Battle of the Scheldt, at least 7 German officers had chosen a bullet over an encounter with the Canadians. But where did this inhuman cruelty come from? The answer lies in events 2 years prior. On August 19, 1942, the Canadians launched a raid on the French port of Dieppe. It was a disaster. In 6 hours, 907 killed and nearly 2,000 taken prisoner. But the losses weren't the worst part. The worst part was what happened to the prisoners. The Germans found traces of binding on the bodies of their soldiers. They interpreted this as a violation of the convention and retaliated. Over 1,000 Canadian prisoners were kept in shackles for a year, literally, with their hands behind their backs. Many were crippled. Dozens died. When the survivors were liberated in 1944, their stories spread through the army like a wildfire. The Canadians decided the Geneva Convention no longer applied. The response would be such that the Germans would regret every tortured prisoner. The methods of the, quote, 26 weren't born in headquarters. They were born in the mud and blood of the Scheldt. Rule 1, never use a firearm if a knife will do. A shot gives away your position. Rule 2, attack from the water. The Germans didn't expect the enemy from an quote, _27 swamp. Rule 3, take no prisoners. A prisoner is a burden. A dead German is not. Rule 4, leave messages, notes, marks on bodies, the word, quote, 28 on a sentry's forehead. Rule 5, never attack from the same direction twice. These rules weren't written in manuals. They were passed down orally like tribal knowledge, and they worked. God, how they worked. But the greatest test was yet to come. By mid-November, the German defense on the Scheldt began to collapse, not from losses, but from exhaustion. Soldiers hadn't slept properly in weeks. Officers couldn't guarantee safety. On November 8th, Breskens fell. The quote, 29 had infiltrated the HQ and eliminated the command before the main attack even began. Without officers, the Germans surrendered in masses, but ahead lay the northern bank, Walcheren Island, the final stronghold, and there a foe more terrifying than the Germans awaited the Canadians, an enemy that couldn't be killed with a knife. Walcheren was a fortress in every sense, heavy batteries, minefields, concrete bunkers, a garrison of 10,000, but the primary defense was water. The island sits below sea level. The RAF bombed the dikes and the sea rushed in. The water was anywhere from 0.5 meter to 3 meters deep, the temperature around 5 degrees Celsius. Survival time, less than an hour. The Germans were certain Walcheren was impregnable. They didn't count on the Canadians. They didn't count on men for whom icy water was home. On November 1st at 4 a.m. in 2 degrees below zero weather, 2 companies began the crossing through the flooded part of the island. They waded chest deep in freezing water, no boats, only rifles held above their heads and knives on their belts. 3 hours in water that would cause a normal person to lose consciousness in 40 minutes. The Canadians kept moving because stopping meant dying. They moved because on the other side were Germans who had to pay, and they made it. What happened next wasn't war. It was a slaughter. By 7 a.m., the first groups reached the German positions exactly where no one expected an attack. Sentries were looking toward the sea. They weren't looking at the swamp. You can only move through a swamp if you are a water rat. The Canadians burst into the positions wet, blue with cold, hair frozen, and absolutely merciless. After 3 hours in the water, they lacked the strength to hold a rifle steady. They used knives, bayonets, and rifle butts. The first line of defense fell in 12 minutes, the second in 8. By 9 a.m., the Canadians controlled 3 kilometers, but the price was staggering. Of the 240 who began the crossing, 170 reached the positions. 80 had frostbite, only 90 remained combat effective. 90 men took a position defended by 500, and that was only the first day. One survivor, Corporal Jean-Pierre Bertrand, wrote in his memoirs, "We stopped being human somewhere in the middle of that swamp. The cold killed everything human in us. All that remained was the desire to reach them and kill." Bertrand was awarded the Military Cross. He never wore it. The battle for Walcheren lasted a week. On November 8th, the last garrison surrendered. The Scheldt estuary was free. Antwerp was open. The first ships entered the port on November 28th. Canadian losses, 12,873, German losses 41,000. But the water rats weren't finished. Ahead lay winter and the Rhine. The winter of 44 to 45 was the coldest in 30 years, minus 20 degrees. Rivers froze. Even Eastern Front veterans complained. The Canadians didn't. They were home. Men from Manitoba, where it hits minus 40, saw the European cold as a brisk chill. Hunters from the Yukon felt as though they were in their own backyards in snow-covered Germany. Night raids continued all winter. The rats crossed frozen rivers, killed, and vanished. By February, their reputation had spread across the entire front, and that was when the mass suicides began. Obersturmführer Kramer, the man this story began with, was no coward. Poland, France, the Balkans, Ukraine, Babi Yar. Punitive operations in Belarus. He was a professional killer, and he was afraid for the first time in his life. His company took positions on the western bank of the Rhine in February 45. Across from them, Canadians. The first night was quiet, the second too. On the third, a sentry vanished. He was found in the morning, frozen into the river ice with his throat slit. On his forehead, the word, quote, 34. It was the beginning of the end. On the fourth night, 3 vanished. On the fifth, 2 more. Every morning brought new bodies, new inscriptions. Kramer requested reinforcements. Denied. Artillery support. Shells were needed elsewhere. Permission to retreat. Ordered to hold. On the 7th night, he wrote to his wife about how they met, their wedding, their daughter. At the end, quote, 35. In the morning, his orderly found the body. A shot to the temple, a note. Quote, 36, anything but the Canadians. By March, at least 11 SS and Wehrmacht officers on the Rhine had committed suicide after being deployed against the Canadians. Dozens more were arrested for refusing to follow orders. And these weren't privates. These were officers, men who had commanded executions. They chose the bullet because the alternative seemed worse. German command tried to hide the epidemic. But by the war's end, the phrase, quote, 37 had become a grim joke that no one found funny. Later, the Allies found a secret order from the HQ of Army Group B, quote, 38. An official admission the Germans could not fight the, quote, 39, but it was too late. On March 23rd, the Allies forced the Rhine, the largest river operation in history, but 12 hours before the main forces, the Canadians went first, not in boats, by swimming 300 men in icy water. They captured a bridgehead before the Germans even realized it. When the first boats with Americans reached the shore in the morning, they were met by wet, muddy, smiling Canadians. Sergeant Maurice Dupont famously told an American major. Major Hiller later wrote, possessed, perhaps the most accurate word. The war ended on May 8, 1945. The 1st Canadian Army liberated much of the Netherlands and entered Germany. Total war losses, about 45,000 killed. The underscore, quote, underscore 42, underscore never officially existed. It was a folk nickname covering dozens of groups with similar tactics. After the war, they returned to ordinary lives, fishermen, farmers, loggers. Most never spoke of the Scheldt or the Rhine. Some couldn't because they never returned. Some wouldn't because what they had done didn't fit the image of the polite Canadian. But the memory remains. It always remains. In 1972, the Dutch organized a memorial ceremony. About 100 veterans arrived, gray-haired old men with medals, flowers, speeches, gratitude. Then, former Corporal Jean-Paul Gauthier, the man who coined the name, asked to speak, and he spoke softly. You don't know how we did it. We became worse than those we fought. We killed them like animals, because they treated our comrades like animals. We were right, but that doesn't mean we were good men. Silence. No one knew how to react. A massive old man from Saskatchewan put a hand on his shoulder. Jean-Paul, shut up. They won't understand, and they shouldn't. Gauthier fell silent. The ceremony continued. No one spoke of the rats again. Today, the Battle of the Scheldt remains one of the least known operations of the war. Hollywood prefers Normandy and Stalingrad. Canadians with knives in their teeth aren't photogenic, but in the Netherlands they remember. Every year, on May 4th and 5th, flowers are placed in Canadian cemeteries. Thousands of graves marked with a maple leaf and the inscription, "Known unto God." They were fishermen and farmers. They were rejected by the regular army for disciplinary problems, and they became the Reich's worst nightmare, the ones SS commanders fled from into death. Anything but the Canadians. Nur nicht Kanadier. In the Canadian War Museum, there is a piece of cardboard with the inscription, "Compliments of the Water Rats." The very first one. Beside it is a photograph. 20 young men in soaked uniforms, smiling. Of those 20, 7 survived to the end of the war. By the 1970s, 3 remained. Today, none are left, but visitors stop before that photograph every day. School children, tourists, elderly Dutch citizens. Sometimes they ask, why were they called water rats? And the guide tells the story of the men who learned to kill in the dark and strike terror into professional murderers, a story Hollywood will never film. It's too frightening and too real. Epilogue: Jean-Paul Gaultier returned to Nova Scotia and worked as a fisherman for the rest of his life. He never told his children about the war. When his grandson asked about the water rats, Gaultier replied, "They weren't rats. They were men who were forced to become rats. Remember that and never let anyone force you." Gaultier passed away in 1989. At his funeral were 2 former comrades, the last survivors. They stood silently by the grave until everyone else had left. Then one, a 90-year-old man, leaned toward the headstone. "See you, rat. You were the best of us." A year later, none were left. But the story remained, of the men from whom the SS fled, of the men who turned the word Canadian into a synonym for a nightmare. The water rats, die Wasserratten. They were perhaps the most terrifying soldiers of the war, and they were your neighbors, your grandfathers. Remember them?